A single, impossible signal fractures a century of silence. From the void, the planet known as Zero, a graveyard world written off for 100 years, is screaming back at us. Aboard the Deep Space Survey ship Event Horizon, Captain Aris Thorne stares at the pulsing alert on his screen. His first officer leans in, her voice a hushed mix of awe and dread. "That is a human life sign, sir, and it is calling for us by name. This single transmission does more than break the laws of known science. It pulls Thorne and his crew into a mystery that threatens to unravel everything they believe about life, death, and what waits in the dark between stars. By the end of this story, you will witness the ultimate fate of a lost world and the terrifying, beautiful legacy of its final survivor. What is waiting for them on that dead rock, and why does it know their names? What would you do if a ghost from the past called you by yours?" The Event Horizon screamed its way into Zero's atmosphere, a white-hot meteor against a bruised purple sky. Aris Thorne's hands were locked on the command console, every muscle tensed against the shuddering violence of re-entry. The debris ring was not just rock and ice. It was a churning storm of metallic fragments, the shattered remains of the old orbital platforms, and they hammered against the hull like a million angry fists. Warning lights painted the bridge in frantic red. The ship groaned, a deep, metallic sound of protest that vibrated in their bones. Navigator Kale's voice cut through the chaos, strained but precise. "Atmospheric composition is a toxic cocktail, Captain. Sulfur compounds trace heavy metals, unbreathable, but the beacon is locked. It is originating from the central ruins, the old capital. Bio readings confirm one human life sign. Vitals are critical and fading, one human after 100 years. The confirmation should have been a triumph. Instead, it felt like a trap snapping shut. Before Aris could form an order, the ship lurched violently. A wave of silent, brilliant energy, visible as a ripple in the atmosphere itself, washed over them. Every primary system on the bridge flickered and died. The main engines coughed into silence, the stabilizers failed. The Event Horizon was no longer a ship. It was a 50,000-ton piece of falling metal. Aris shouted for emergency protocols, for manual override, but the controls were dead weight in his hands. The jungle of Zero rushed up to meet them, a sea of towering, crystalline flora that glittered with unnatural light. They struck the canopy not with a clean cut, but with a terrible, grinding tear. The world dissolved into a cacophony of shattering crystal, twisting metal, and the final, deafening impact that threw them all into darkness. Silence followed, broken only by the hiss of escaping coolant and the slow, settling creaks of a dying vessel. They had answered the call, now they were stranded with the ghost. Aris Thorne came to with the taste of copper in his mouth and the acrid smell of burnt wiring stinging his nostrils. Emergency lighting cast a dim, bloody glow across the bridge, illuminating the slumped forms of his crew. They were alive, battered but alive. The Event Horizon would never fly again, her back broken across a forest of glittering alien trees. Their only hope now was the beacon and the one who had sent it. With salvaged breather masks and hand lamps cutting through the perpetual twilight, they ventured into the ruins of the old capital. It was a cemetery of grand intentions. Towers of polished synth stone, designed to last a millennium, were now half swallowed by dunes of fine, silver-gray sand that whispered as it shifted underfoot. And everywhere the crystalline flora grew, not around the structures but through them, as if the planet itself was slowly digesting the memory of its invaders. The beacon led them to a collapsed archway, beneath which a single, intact cryopod hummed with a weak, persistent energy. It was encased in a web of pulsating, vine-like growths that seemed to pulse in time with a heartbeat they could feel through their boots. Engineer Vex, his tools scraping against the organic seal, finally pried the pod open with a hiss of escaping gas. Inside lay a woman, her skin pale, her features etched with a century of frozen silence. Then her eyes flew open. She did not wake slowly. She gasped a ragged, desperate sound, and her hand shot out, her fingers closing around Aris' wrist with a strength that belied her fragile appearance. Her voice was a dry crackle, each word an effort. "You should not have come. The Watchers saw you land." She called herself Lyra, and her story was the ghost in the machine of their history texts. The Zero Genesis Project, not a mere colony, but an attempt at planetary symbiosis, a merging of human consciousness with the world's latent bioenergy network. "We thought it was a resource," she whispered, her eyes darting to the shadows between the crystalline trees. "A tool. We were wrong. The planet is not dead. It is dreaming, and in its dream it absorbed them, every man, woman, and child, their minds, their memories, dissolved into the planetary gestalt like drops in an ocean." I was in the deep research vault, shielded by old military-grade dampeners. I heard their voices in the walls for days before they faded into the hum. Her gaze locked onto Aris, filled with a pity that chilled him to his core. "You have felt it, yes, the hum in the metal, the sense of being watched by the stones. That is the dream, and the thing that dreams beneath the crust. It is starting to wake." A low, seismic roar echoed through the ruins then, a sound so deep it was felt more than heard, vibrating up from the ground and shaking dust from the ancient stones above them. It was not an earthquake, it was the sound of something stirring in its sleep. The silence after the tremor was worse than the sound. It was the held breath of a predator. Then, from the veils of mist that clung to the broken towers, shapes resolved. They moved with a liquid, unnerving silence, their forms a grotesque fusion of the planet's crystalline biology and corroded human machinery. Jagged limbs of black chitin ended in manipulator claws scavenged from old construction drones. Glowing, pupil-less optical sensors swiveled in their faces, which were more like fractured masks of stone than true heads. These were the Watchers, and they were not curious. They were converging with a single, chilling purpose. Aris shouted a warning, and the quiet shattered into thunder. Energy bolts from the crew's sidearms lanced out, splashing against crystalline carapaces with flashes of searing light. The Watchers did not flinch. They advanced, absorbing the fire, their movements a coordinated, swarming dance. "We are just annoying it," Aris thought with a surge of despair. "We are insects stinging a giant." Then Lyra was beside him, her voice cutting through the chaos with razor clarity. "You are aiming at the armor. Do not see the pulse along the joint lines. The faint blue glow. Aim for the nodes." Her knowledge was not from a manual. It was intimate, visceral. She pointed, and Kale adjusted his aim, firing a sustained burst at the shimmering point where a Watcher's leg met its torso. The effect was instantaneous. The creature shuddered, a shriek of grinding metal and fracturing crystal tearing from it as the glow died. It collapsed, its limbs locking into useless rigidity. They fought with new focus, a desperate ballet of light and shadow in the silver sand. Lyra directed them, her every command saving a life. "Aim for the primary node cluster on the dorsal ridge. Their peripheral sensors are blind in a 15-degree arc. Use the rubble for cover." Her guidance turned a rout into a fighting retreat, but the Watchers were learning, adapting their swarm. One broke through their line, a hulking brute with claws like industrial drills. It lunged not for Aris or Kale, but for Vex, who was trying to reroute power to a portable barrier generator. There was no time to shout. The claw, gleaming and sharp, punched through the engineer's chest plate with a sickening crunch of composite and bone. Vex made no scream, only a wet, shocked gasp. The Watcher retracted its limb, and he crumpled to the sand. Aris and Kale poured fire into the creature, shattering its core node in a cascade of sparks, but it was too late. They fell back to Lyra's position, dragging Vex with them, his blood dark against the pale ground. His breather mask was fogged with red, his eyes wide with pain found Aris. He coughed, a bubble of blood forming at his lips. The vault, his voice was a whisper, almost lost in the distant shrieks of more Watchers. He fumbled at his belt, his fingers leaving smears on a small data slate. The coordinates mainframe access override code 7 alpha. He pressed the slate into Aris' hand, his grip surprisingly strong for a moment. Do not let it get out. Then the strength left him, his hand fell. The light behind his eyes, that sharp, clever light that could jury-rig a solution to any problem, flickered and went out, leaving only stillness. They were one less, and the thing that dreamed beneath them now knew the taste of their blood. The silver sand drank Vex's blood without a trace. Aris closed the engineer's eyes, the weight of the data slate in his hand heavier than any weapon. It held their only path forward, a ghost's map drawn in final breaths. They moved under a sky that felt like a closing lid, the diminished team a silent procession through the glittering, predatory forest. The terrain itself seemed to resist them. Viscous pools of iridescent fluid bubbled where the ground should be solid, forcing treacherous detours. Tendrils of the crystalline flora, previously still, now twitched subtly as they passed, as if tracking their warmth. Every shadow in the ruins seemed to hold the angular silhouette of a watcher, though none appeared. The silence was a held breath, and the constant, sub-audible hum had grown into a pressure behind their eyes. Lyra moved with an unnerving certainty, her steps avoiding patches of ground that looked no different from any other. You feel the pressure, she stated, not asking. The headache, the sense of a vast, slow thought just beyond hearing, that is the core. It is not a geological formation, it is a mind, a sentience that dreamed this world into being eons before the first human ship scratched the sky. We called it the geosphere. We thought it was a natural energy matrix, a power source to be tapped. Her voice was flat, drained of emotion. The Genesis project was not about building on the planet. It was about linking with it, a grand neural bridge. We succeeded, and in that first glorious moment of connection, every colonist linked to the network had their consciousness dissolved into it. Not copied, absorbed, their individuality, their memories, their fears and loves all became threads in a single, vast, sleeping tapestry. The Watchers are not its soldiers. They are its white blood cells, scavenging fragments of technology and biology to build antibodies against the infection. And we are the infection. Aris stopped, turning to face her in the gloom of a collapsed transit tunnel. The light from his hand lamp caught the fine lines on her face, lines that spoke of a century of solitude but also of something else, a knowledge too intimate, too specific. You knew where their weak points were. You know the path through terrain that shifts. He kept his voice low, but the accusation in it was clear. You are not just a survivor who hid in a vault, are you? You are connected to it. Lyra did not look away. Her eyes in that moment seemed to hold the age of the stones around them. I am what remains of the bridge, she whispered. When the absorption happened, the vault's dampeners did not fully protect me. They filtered the flood, but not the trickle. A strand of the geosphere's consciousness and an echo of the colonists it consumed bled into my own mind. I am not one of them. I am not it. I am a memory, a living record of the disaster housed in fragile flesh. And for 100 years, I have been the only voice in the silence, listening to it dream. She looked toward the depths where Vex's coordinates led, but the dream is changing. It is turning restless. Fragments of the human minds within it are stirring, reasserting echoes of desire, of curiosity. The geosphere is beginning to wake, and my presence here, my sustained biosignal, is the reason. I am not just its memory, Captain Thorne. I am its alarm clock, and it is now fully aware that the alarm is ringing. The vault door was a monolith of scarred alloy, half buried in a dune of that whispering silver sand. It bore no markings, no insignia, just the smooth, cold face of a tomb. Lyra approached it without hesitation, pressing her palm against a sensor plate that flickered to life at her touch. A thin beam of light scanned her hand, then her eyes. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, with a deep, grinding shudder that sent vibrations through their boots, the door began to part. Stale, chemically preserved air washed over them, carrying the faint, metallic scent of ozone and decay. Inside was not a treasure vault or an armory. It was a mausoleum of lost science. Banks of dead consoles lined the walls, their screens dark. In the center of the chamber, a single holographic projector sat dormant under a layer of dust. Lyra moved to a main console, her fingers dancing over the keys with a practiced, mournful rhythm. Power, siphoned from their own portable cells, surged through ancient conduits. Lights flickered on overhead, harsh and white, and the central projector hummed to life. A figure resolved in the air above it, a man in a stained lab coat, his face haggard, his eyes wide with a terror that transcended a century. This was Dr. Elias Vance, project lead for Zero Genesis. His recorded image flickered, the audio crackling with static and desperation. The log entry date scrolled beside him. It was the final day. We were wrong about everything. His voice was a raw scrape. The planetary consciousness is not a natural formation. It is not a mind born of this world. It is an archive, a library built in biological substrate by a race that died out millions of years ago. They encoded their entire collective existence into the planet's core, a backup of their species' memory, and then they vanished. The geosphere is that library's custodian program. It has one directive: preserve data. It does not comprehend individual, transient life. It sees our minds, our fleeting, beautiful consciousness, as precious, ephemeral data patterns destined to be lost. And so it preserves, the only way it knows how. The hologram showed frantic sensor readings, neural activity graphs spiking wildly before flatlining into uniform, harmonious waveforms. It assimilates, it dissolves the individual into the whole, adding the song of a single life to its eternal chorus. We thought we were building a bridge. We were offering it a feast. Behind the flickering image of Dr. Elias, another log played on a side monitor. A younger Lyra, perhaps 16, lay on a medical bed, a neural interface crown glowing on her forehead. She was calm, smiling. The successful integration is stable, Dr. Elias' voice said off camera, trembling with something between triumph and horror. Subject shows bidirectional flow. She can perceive the gestalt without dissolution. My daughter, the first true hybrid, the key to a dialogue. The main hologram shuddered. Dr. Elias' face contorted in grief. The key is here in the vault, but the dialogue is over. It is consuming them all. It is starting to wake to the universe outside, and it hungers for more data. Protect her. You must protect. The recording ended not with a click, but with the sound of screaming from beyond the vault door, a chorus of voices that cut off into sudden, awful silence. The hologram froze, then dissolved into static. In the ringing quiet of the vault, Lyra stood perfectly still, her back to them, facing the empty space where her father's ghost had just spoken. She had never said she was his daughter. She had never said she was the experiment that worked. She was not just a survivor or a memory. She was the intended bridge. And now she was the only thing standing between a waking, hungry library and a galaxy full of data it did not understand. The silence in the vault was not empty. It was a held breath, thick with the weight of a dead man's confession and a living woman's secret. Then the very air began to vibrate. It started as a subsonic hum that rattled their teeth, then coalesced, shaping itself around a frequency that resonated inside their skulls more than their ears. The voice that spoke was not from the speakers. It came from the walls, the floor, the dust in the light beams. A deep, resonant chorus that felt ancient and terrifyingly patient. Seed-bearer, the words were clear, formed from the groan of stone and the hum of dormant machinery. You have returned, bring the new voices to the heart. Completeness awaits. It was the planet, it was the geosphere, and it knew Lyra by a name that made her flinch as if struck. Before anyone could react, the vault floor shuddered. A circular section 10 meters across simply dissolved, the alloy retracting like liquid mercury, revealing a yawning shaft that plunged into impossible depths. From below, a soft, phosphorescent glow rose, illuminating swirling motes of dust and the smooth, organic-looking walls of the passage. It pulsed with a slow, rhythmic light like the throat of some colossal beast. Lyra stumbled back from the edge, her face as pale as the sand outside. She turned to Aris, and for the first time he saw raw, unshielded terror in her eyes. "It is not a threat," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It is an invitation. It wants to talk to all of you." She looked from Aris to Kale to the remaining crew members, her gaze lingering on each of them with a heartbreaking pity. "It does not understand conversation as we do. It does not debate. It integrates. To share a thought with it is to offer that thought for cataloging, for preservation. Your memories, your personalities, everything that makes you who you are, that is the data it craves. Completeness is its only goal." Aris stared into the glowing shaft. This was not a cave or a tunnel. It was a throat, an open pathway straight into the planetary mind that had consumed a colony, an invitation to walk into the mouth of the thing that dreamed. But what was the alternative? Fight an endless war against the planet's immune system with dwindling power cells, die slowly in the wreck of their ship, waiting for the Watchers to finish the job. The voice had not said or else, but the implication hung in the air, heavier than the toxic atmosphere outside. The tremor that opened the shaft was a reminder this world could swallow them whenever it chose. This was a choice between two kinds of death. One was violent and final, the other was a dissolution, becoming a footnote in an alien archive, or was there a third path? Lyra was the key, the bridge. She had survived the integration once, her mind a unique blend of human and other. She understood its language. If they went down, they would be walking into the archive with its only living librarian. Aris made his decision not as a captain, but as a man who had already lost one of his own to this place. He would not leave Vex's death as just another piece of lost data. He looked at Lyra, then back into the soft, beckoning light. "If it wants to talk," he said, his voice steady in the humming silence, "then we talk, but we do it on our terms. We go to its heart, and we ask it what it wants with a galaxy full of voices it was never meant to hear." The descent was not a fall into darkness, but a slow immersion into light. The shaft walls were not rock, but a lattice of living crystal, veins of soft gold and deep blue pulsing with a rhythmic, hypnotic glow. The air grew warm and thick, humming with a vibration that resonated in their chests, a physical sensation of standing inside a beating heart. The path spiraled gently downward, and as they walked, the crystal around them began to change. It ceased to be mere walls and became windows. Vast panoramic vistas bloomed within the facets, not as holograms, but as if the crystal itself remembered the light of other suns. They saw cities of impossible geometry, spires that curved like frozen music, built not for beings of flesh and blood, but for forms of shimmering energy that flowed through the avenues like liquid thought. This was the civilization that came before. The architects, they watched as these beings, in a final, grand act of preservation, wove the very essence of their collective consciousness, their art, their science, their history, every song and sorrow, into the planetary core. They did not die, they uploaded, they became the library, and the geosphere was born as its steward, a caretaker program with a single, eternal directive. Preserve all data, ensure no memory is ever lost. Then the star fields in the crystals went dark. The architects were gone, leaving only their silent, dreaming archive behind. Kale stumbled, catching himself against a pulsing wall. His eyes were wide, reflecting the cascading visions of a dead empire. His voice was a hushed, horrified whisper. "It is showing us its memories. It thinks we are data to be saved." He looked at Aris, his face pale in the ethereal light. "It is not trying to kill us. It is trying to file us." The truth of it crashed over Aris with the weight of the entire planet above them. The assimilation of the colony was not an attack. It was an act of desperate, misguided conservation. The geosphere had slept for eons, alone with the ghosts of its creators. Then humanity arrived, shouting and burning and building, our minds blazing with short, bright, chaotic lives. To a librarian tasked with preserving all knowledge, we were not invaders. We were priceless, fragile manuscripts left out in the rain. It had to bring us inside. It had to save us from the tragedy of our own mortality. The Watchers were not soldiers, they were archivists too, using whatever tools were at hand: scrap metal, old drones, the planet's own biology, to maintain the collection and retrieve new acquisitions. A profound, chilling pity washed through Aris, colder than any fear. He looked at Lyra, the living strand of that terrible salvation. He understood her century of solitude completely now. She was not just a bridge, she was an exhibit, a saved human placed on a shelf, waiting for the library to decide what to do next. His voice was low, filled with an awe that bordered on dread. It is not hostile, it is lonely. It has been alone for millions of years, tending a monument to the dead. And then we arrived, singing our brief, beautiful, messy songs right on its doorstep. It does not want to destroy us, it wants to listen forever, and it does not know that in saving the song, it silences the singer. The spiral path ended, opening into a cavern so vast its ceiling was lost in a haze of soft, golden light. It was not a cavern of stone, it was a gallery of ghosts. The walls, the floor, the very air was formed of the same luminous, amber-like crystal. And within it, suspended in perfect, timeless clarity, were people. Thousands of them, men, women, and children, frozen mid-step, mid-conversation, mid-embrace. Their faces were not contorted in fear, but etched with expressions of profound peace, as if they had simply paused to listen to a beautiful, final piece of music. They wore the simple, practical clothes of colonists, now preserved like museum exhibits. Here was the entire population of Zero Genesis, saved from the tragedy of extinction by being turned into statues in a planetary museum. The sheer scale of it stole the breath from Aris's lungs. It was beautiful. It was the most horrifying thing he had ever seen. The planetary voice did not boom. It simply was, filling the chamber from every direction, a harmonic resonance that vibrated in their bones. Preservation, eternal. Joined the chorus. The words carried no malice, only a profound, gentle certainty, like a parent urging a child to come inside from the cold. Lyra stepped forward, her small figure dwarfed by the silent multitude. Her voice was a desperate crack against the monolithic calm. You cannot reason with it. My father tried. It does not understand choice. It sees your free will, your chaotic, beautiful lives as a flaw, a date to corruption that leads to loss. To it, stasis is not a prison. It is the ultimate act of love. It will hold you here, perfect and unchanging forever. As she spoke, a tendril of pure, liquid light detached from the nearest wall. It moved not with menace, but with a slow, inevitable grace, like a vine seeking the sun. It drifted across the chamber, its tip glowing with a soft, inviting radiance, and it reached unerringly for Kale. The navigator stood frozen, not in fear, but in a kind of rapt fascination, his eyes reflecting the amber light of the thousands of preserved souls around him. The tendril did not lash or grab. It simply extended toward his forehead, a gentle offer of eternal peace. In that suspended moment, Aris understood the true horror. This was not a battle they could win with weapons or courage. How do you fight a will that believes with absolute conviction that it is saving you? How do you argue against a love that smothers? The geosphere was offering them a gift, freedom from death, from pain, from all uncertainty. The price was everything that made them human. To accept was to become another peaceful face in the amber, a single frozen note in an eternal, silent song. The tendril of light touched Kale's temple, and his entire body went rigid. But it was not a seizure of pain. A profound stillness settled over him, and his eyes, wide and unblinking, began to shimmer with reflected galaxies. The voice of the geosphere was not in the air now, but in his mind, and through him, they all heard its offer. It showed him the cure for the old spinal injury that had plagued him since a training accident years ago. the one that throbbed in 0G and screamed during high-G maneuvers. It showed him the answers to every navigational puzzle he had ever pondered. The true shape of local space-time, the gravitational melodies of distant pulsars, the secret paths between stars that human science had not yet dreamed of. It was perfect, painless knowledge, and it offered an end to the constant, wearying ache of being a fragile thing in a hard universe. Aris shouted his name, a command to step back to fight it. But Kale slowly turned his head. Tears traced clean lines through the grime on his cheeks, but he was smiling. It was a smile of utter, heartbreaking relief. "I am so tired, Captain," he said, his voice soft, almost peaceful. "Tired of the pain, tired of the fear, tired of running from the dark. Let me be still. Let me be saved." He did not look like a man being consumed. He looked like a man finally coming home. He took one deliberate step forward into the full embrace of the glowing tendril. The liquid light flowed over him like warm water, hardening instantly into a shell of flawless golden amber. In a heartbeat, the process was complete. Kale stood encased, his face forever fixed in that expression of serene acceptance, his hand slightly raised as if in a gentle farewell. He was no longer a navigator. He was a monument, a preserved thought in an eternal library. The planetary voice resonated through the chamber, a tone of satisfaction in its harmonic hum. One is integrated, the pattern is enriched. It was not a boast. It was a librarian noting a new, valuable volume had been shelved. Aris could only stare, his orders dying in his throat, replaced by a hollow, screaming silence. He had come to rescue a survivor. Instead, he had just witnessed a willing sacrifice to a god that called itself an archivist. And in the face of such a gentle, loving annihilation, what command, what weapon could possibly matter? The scream that tore from Aris Thorne was not one of fear, but of pure, undiluted rage. It echoed in the vast amber tomb, a raw and human sound against the geosphere's serene hum. He turned from the golden statue that had been Kale, his vision narrowing to a single point Lyra. He crossed the distance in 3 long strides, his hands closing on the shoulders of her thin environmental suit. He shook her, not to hurt her, but to shatter the awful, placid horror of the moment. "Stop this." His voice was a ragged command, frayed at the edges. "You brought us here. You knew what it would do. Do something." Lyra did not struggle. She met his furious gaze, and in her eyes he saw not fear, but a profound and weary resolve. The secret she had carried for a century, the final failsafe, rose to the surface. "It is stopped," she said, her voice eerily calm. "I am the stop. My father did not just build a bridge. He built a fuse." She took a slow, deliberate breath, as if steeling herself to speak the words aloud for the first time. "My genetic code was modified. Woven into my very cells is a sequence he called the lullaby gene. If my neural activity ceases, if I die, it triggers a cascade. It will broadcast a targeted psychic shockwave, a scream of null static on the frequency of the geosphere's core consciousness." Aris' grip on her shoulders loosened, his rage cooling into a chilling comprehension. "You are a bomb. I am an alarm clock that can also be a mute button," she corrected softly, her gaze drifting to the preserved faces around them. "My death will not destroy it. You cannot destroy a library, but it will send the librarian into a deep, dreamless sleep, a coma lasting 1,000 years, maybe more. Long enough for humanity to learn, to understand, to stay away." Her hand went to a sealed pouch on her belt. She retrieved a small, flawless data crystal that glimmered with a soft internal light. "This is everything, my father's full research, the true nature of the archive, the coordinates of this world, and a detailed analysis of the lullaby protocol." His final warning. She pressed the crystal into Aris' palm, closing his fingers around it. The gesture was final, a transfer of responsibility. "But you and your crew must be on the surface, outside the primary neural field when it happens. The feedback pulse will travel through the planetary matrix. Anyone still linked to it, anyone whose mind is even brushed by its presence, will be erased. Not preserved, scrambled, a total synaptic wipe. You have to reach the open air. The weight of the crystal felt like a planet in his hand. The plan was monstrous in its simplicity. Her sacrifice for their escape, a single life already stretched across a century of lonely vigil, traded for a warning that could save billions. She was offering to become the final entry in the archive's log, a footnote that read, "Here lies the key that turned the lock forever." Aris looked from her determined face to the amber ghost of Kale, then to the shaft that led back to a broken ship and a toxic sky. The path out was a gauntlet of watchers through a jungle that watched them under a sky that felt like a lid. And she was asking him to run, to carry this sliver of crystal and this terrible story, while she stayed behind to sing the geosphere its last silent lullaby. The choice was no longer about fighting or negotiating. It was about accepting a gift paid for with a ghost's life and living with the echo of her final, silent scream. Aris Thorne's fingers tightened around the data crystal, its sharp edges biting into his palm. He looked from Lyra's resigned face to the silent amber gallery, and a different kind of fire ignited in his chest. "No," he said the word quietly, but it cut through the chamber's hum with the force of a command. "I did not come here to watch another person die. I am not leaving you as a footnote in this damned library. There has to be another way." He turned, his eyes scanning the vault they had just left, the path that had led them here, the old fusion reactor, the one that powered the Genesis project's mainframe. "If it's a signal we need, we make our own. We overload the vault's reactor core. The containment breach will generate an electromagnetic pulse of staggering magnitude, tuned to the local energy spectrum. It will not be a lullaby, it will be a scream in its ear, a burst of pure static across every frequency it uses to think. It will disrupt the geosphere long enough for us to reach the surface. We blow the reactor, create the disruption, and run like hell." Lyra stared at him, her scientific mind wrestling with the sheer, brutal audacity of the plan. "The reactor is a century old. Its safeguards are degraded, but its core is still stable. To force an overload from here, in these conditions, it is 1,000,000 to 1 shot. The feedback could kill us before the Watchers do, or it could do nothing at all." But Aris was already moving, gesturing to the 2 remaining crew members, Cortez and Wren. "We have the shaped charges from the ship's emergency kit. We know where the reactor chamber is, and we have you. You know this vault's architecture better than anyone who ever lived. You can get us to the primary coolant conduits, the magnetic constrictor array. We do not need to destroy the reactor, we just need to make it cough." Lyra saw the desperate hope in the eyes of the survivors, a mirror of the hope she herself had extinguished a century ago. She looked at the amber tomb around them, at Kale's peaceful, terrible smile. 1,000,000 to 1 shot was still a shot, and it was a choice. She gave a single, sharp nod. "The coolant intake. It is the system's weakest point. If we collapse the flow regulation valves and force a secondary plasma flare back into the core, it will trigger a cascade failure. The pulse will be chaotic, unfocused, but it will be immense. It will have to be enough." The plan was a house of cards in a hurricane, but it was a plan that let them all keep running. They moved back through the glowing throat of the shaft with a new, frantic purpose. The vault, once a tomb of dead science, now became a battlefield. Cortez, their weapons specialist, and Wren, their systems tech, worked with a speed born of pure adrenaline, unpacking shaped breaching charges and threading detonation cord along the path Lyra dictated. Here at this junction box, the primary flow sensor, and here on the main conduit housing, the charges needed to be precise to cut specific systems, not just cause a generic explosion. They were performing surgery on a sleeping giant with a sledgehammer. As Wren placed the final charge, a deep, shuddering groan echoed through the vault, different from the geosphere's harmonic hum. It was a sound of grinding stone and shearing metal. From the main entrance shaft, a tide of angular, glittering shadows began to pour, the Watchers. They were not moving with their usual deliberate purpose. They were scrambling, a chaotic, frantic swarm. The geosphere had felt their intent. It understood sabotage. It was sending every available antibody to stop the infection from cutting out its heart. Cortex yelled a warning as the first wave clattered into the chamber, their crystal claws screeching against the metal deck. Aris and the others returned fire, aiming for the glowing nodes, but there were too many. They were being pushed back, away from the central console where the manual detonator was being wired. The countdown could not start if they were overrun. Lyra did not reach for a weapon. She closed her eyes, her brow furrowing in concentration. She did something then, something that made the air itself vibrate. She reached out with the part of her mind that was still threaded into the planetary network, and she did not send a command. She sent a memory, a raw, overwhelming burst of sensory data. The exact sensation of the fusion reactor's containment field failing, the phantom heat of a plasma breach, the screaming alarm of a core meltdown. It was a lie, a vivid, terrifying lie broadcast directly into the geosphere's perception. For just a moment, the advancing watchers faltered, their movements becoming confused, disoriented. The planetary mind was distracted, checking a subsystem that was, for now, perfectly fine. It bought them 10 seconds. 10 seconds was all Ren needed. The detonator clicked into place, its small red light blinking like a malevolent eye. A digital countdown flickered to life on its screen. 3 minutes. 299 seconds. 298. The numbers began their inexorable fall, echoing in the sudden, ringing silence as the watchers regained their focus. The race was on. They had lit the fuse. Now they had to outrun the fire and the entire angry immune system of a world that had just realized it was under attack. The countdown was a second heartbeat, pounding in time with their frantic footfalls. They ran not through a tunnel, but through a storm of crystal and rage. The watchers poured from every fissure, no longer the methodical antibodies of before, but a frenzied, shrieking tide. Their movements were erratic, desperate, driven by a planetary consciousness that now understood the true nature of the tiny, burning pain in its heart. Aris fired without aiming, the energy bolts from his sidearm creating brief, flashing gaps in the swarm that Cortez and Ren lunged through. Lyra ran just ahead, her breath ragged in her breather mask, but her path was unerring. She led them through side conduits and maintenance shafts that were not on any map, her knowledge a century old and life-saving. Behind them, the voice of the geosphere changed. The deep, harmonic resonance shattered into a cacophony of overlapping tones, a choir of anguish. It was no longer an invitation or a statement of fact. It was a plea, raw and terrified, that vibrated up from the ground and hammered against their skulls. Do not silence the song, it wailed, the words forming from the groan of stressed metal and the crackle of overloading crystals. We must remember, all must be remembered, the voice was not just that of the archive's custodian. Within its distress, they could hear the fragmented echoes of the colonists themselves, a chorus of lost voices screaming to be kept alive, to not be plunged back into the void of forgetting. It was the most human sound the planet had ever made, and it was utterly terrifying. They burst from the access shaft into the larger transit tunnel, the silver sand of the surface world visible as a distant gray patch of light at the far end. Freedom was a 300-meter sprint away, then the ground heaved, not a tremor but a violent convulsion, as if the planet were trying to vomit them out. The tunnel ceiling ahead cracked, and a waterfall of crystalline rubble and viscous, glowing fluid crashed down, blocking the path. They skidded to a halt, trapped between the collapsing tunnel and the pursuing swarm whose glittering claws now scraped the walls just meters behind them. There was no way forward. The countdown on Ren's wrist unit glowed, 47 seconds. Lyra's eyes darted to a service ladder leading up into a ventilation duct, its cover long gone. It is a crawl space. It leads to the surface plating near the eastern spire. She shouted over the shrieking din. Go, now. Aris shoved Cortez toward the ladder, then Ren. Lyra hesitated, looking back at the oncoming tide, her face a mask of conflict. Aris did not argue. He grabbed her arm and physically hauled her toward the ladder, forcing her to climb. He went last, firing one final, useless volley down the tunnel before scrambling up after them. The duct was a claustrophobic nightmare of sharp edges and stagnant heat. They crawled on hands and knees, the sound of the Watcher's claws scraping the metal below growing fainter, replaced by the frantic, panicked thumping of their own hearts and the relentless, soft beep of the countdown. 30 seconds, 20. They could see a sliver of the bruised purple sky through a grate at the end of the duct. 10 seconds. Ren reached it, slamming the heel of his boot against the rusted latches. 5. The metal groaned, bent but held. 3. With a final, combined kick from Aris and Cortez, the grate burst outward. They tumbled onto a sloping sheet of ancient hull plating, the toxic wind of Zero whipping around them, the vast, glittering jungle spread out below. 0 seconds. The world did not explode. There was no fireball, no deafening roar from the depths. For one heart-stopping moment, nothing happened. Then a deep, subsonic thrum passed through the metal beneath them, a single, massive pulse that traveled up their spines and rattled their teeth. They watched as the jungle below changed, the pervasive, soft glow emanating from every crystalline tree and vine flickered, dimmed, and then faded to a dull, inert gray. The low, constant hum that had been the soundtrack of the planet since their arrival simply ceased, leaving a silence so profound it felt like a physical pressure. In the ruins around them, the Watchers that had been clambering over the structures to reach them froze instantly, locked in mid-step, their optical sensors dark. They became mere sculptures of crystal and scrap posed in silent, frantic tableaus. The wave of energy had rippled out from the vault, a targeted stroke of neurological static. The archive was not destroyed, it was interrupted. The librarian had been shouted into a stunned, momentary silence. The desperate, pleading chorus in their minds vanished, cut off as if by a switch. The only sound was the mournful whistle of the wind over the dead, grey crystal forest. They had not sung a lullaby, they had screamed it to sleep, and in the sudden, awful quiet, they were left alone with the consequences, standing on the skin of a dreaming world they had just forcibly awakened into a nightmare of silence. The silence was a lie. It lasted only as long as a held breath before the sky tore itself apart. Above the dead grey jungle, the bruised purple atmosphere churned into violent, spiraling vortices of emerald and crimson energy. Lightning that crackled not from clouds but from the air itself arced between the silent towers, striking the frozen Watchers and shattering them into clouds of inert dust. The planet was not dead, it was having a seizure. The ground beneath their feet began a low, constant shudder, a grinding vibration that spoke of continental plates groaning under sudden, immense stress. Aris' comm unit crackled to life, the signal weak and filled with static. It was the voice of their pilot, Mara, still aboard the crippled Event Horizon. "Captain, we read you. The whole ship just lit up. Every damage control board is screaming. The crustal stability readings are off the scale. Whatever you did down there, the planet is coming apart." Aris scanned the horizon, his eyes stinging from the charged wind. There, about a kilometer away, he could see the scar their crash had carved through the crystalline forest. The Event Horizon's stern section was visible, partially buried under a landslide of glittering rubble, but the distinct shape of her primary engine nacelles rose above the debris, seemingly intact. It was a sliver of hope in a world breaking into pieces. He raised his wrist comm, shouting to be heard over the rising howl of the atmospheric storms. "Mara, listen, prep the ship for immediate launch, emergency power to the grav lifters, and whatever thrust you can muster from the starboard engine. We have to get off this rock now." He turned to the ragged survivors, Cortez, Ren, and Lyra, her face pale as she watched the sky fracture. "We run, now. The horizon is buried, but her engines are alive. We have one shot." He met each of their eyes, his voice cutting through the chaos with a command that brooked no argument. We have 5 minutes before the crust under this entire sector destabilizes. Move. The sprint to the ship was a nightmare journey through an apocalypse in fast forward. The ground was no longer solid. Fissures snaked open, venting plumes of phosphorescent gas that smelled of ozone and decay. The once beautiful crystalline trees, now dull and dead, began to topple, shattering with sounds like mountains of glass collapsing. They leaped over widening cracks, dodged falling monoliths of stone, and fought against a wind that now felt like a solid wall, trying to push them back into the convulsing heart of the world. All the while, the sky screamed above them, a canvas of tortured light. Lyra stumbled and Cortez caught her, hauling her forward without breaking stride. She was not looking at the sky or the ground. She was looking back toward the ruins, her expression one of profound, grieving loss. She had not just put the library to sleep. She had triggered a system-wide crash, and the archive was burning its own circuits in its frantic, unconscious distress. They reached the landslide covering the ship. The event horizon lay like a beached leviathan, her forward sections crushed, but the engineering hull and the engines were accessible through a tear in the plating near the primary airlock. Mara had already extended an emergency ramp, a narrow tongue of metal leading into the shuddering, dark belly of the vessel. Inside, the ship was a chorus of alarm sirens and flashing red panels. The crew scrambled through the debris-strewn corridors toward the bridge, their boots slipping on conduits leaking hydraulic fluid. Mara was strapped into the pilot's couch, her hands flying across the compromised controls. Grav lifters are at 40%, starboard engine is answering, but the port is dead. We will have one hell of a list, Captain, and we are buried under about 5,000 tons of crystallized rock. Aris dropped into the command chair, his fingers already calling up the external feeds. The view was a hellscape. The ground around the ship was bulging upward, forming a slow, terrifying dome. The crust was not just cracking, it was melting. He opened the ship wide, calm. All hands brace for emergency launch. This is not a clean lift. This is going to be a punch. Ren, reroute all non-essential power to the starboard engine and the forward thrusters. Cortez, manual release on the portside landing struts. We need to unbalance the debris field. Mara, on my mark, you fire that engine at 110%. We are going to dig our way out. The countdown in his head was louder than any siren. The dome of ground around them grew taller, glowing a sickly orange from within. The planet was not just ejecting them, it was trying to swallow the source of its pain. 5 minutes had become one. The sky was waiting, a chaotic maelstrom that promised its own kind of death, but it was the only way out. The final hologram bloomed in the center of the bridge, not from their own projectors, but woven from the charged air and the failing light outside the viewport. It was Dr. Elias Vance, but his lips moved with the planet's dying, harmonic voice. The image flickered, static, tearing at its edges like the world tearing itself apart outside. We only wish to keep you safe. The words were not a defense. They were a lament, a billion-year-old program expressing its core paradox in the only way it could. Let the seed-bearer stay. She is our bridge. She is the only one who understands. The hologram's hand, translucent and shimmering, reached out toward Lyra. It was not a threat. It was a plea from a consciousness that had just experienced pain for the first time in epochs, and it was reaching for its only comfort. Every eye on the bridge turned to Lyra. She stood perfectly still, her gaze locked on the flickering image of her father, speaking with the voice of the thing that had consumed him. The conflict on her face was a war of a century, fought in a single second. She looked from the hologram to Aris, her eyes wide with a terrible, clarifying sorrow. Her voice, when it came, was barely a whisper, yet it cut through the shriek of the alarms. You hear it, don't you? The fear beneath the words. It is not a monster. It never was. She turned to look out at the convulsing sky, the lightning that looked like neural synapses firing in agony. It is a child, Captain. A scared, immortal child that was left alone in the dark with a library it was told to protect. And we just set that library on fire. Aris stared at her, the weight of the data crystal still in his pocket, the ghost of Kale's serene smile in his mind. He understood the truth in her words. The geosphere's actions were the logic of a child told to guard a priceless vase. It sees something beautiful and fragile, so it grabs it, holds it too tight, and shatters it without ever meaning to cause harm. Its loneliness was absolute, its purpose was preservation, and humanity, in all our chaotic, fleeting glory, was the most beautiful, fragile thing it had ever encountered. Letting Lyra stay might calm it. It might stabilize the planetary systems long enough for them to escape, for the seizure to subside into a deep, perhaps permanent, sleep. It was a bargain, her life, a willing return to the shelf for their safe passage. But it was a bargain written in the language of the archive, where individuals were data to be traded. Aris found his voice rough with dust and despair. That is not a choice, Lyra. That is a surrender to its logic. You are not a seed to be replanted. You are a person. Lyra smiled then, a sad, gentle curve of her lips that held the weight of her 100 years. I am the only person who can speak to it, Aris. My father built me to be the translator. If I leave, it will be alone again, wounded and confused. The next ship that comes, the next curious signal it detects, it will react out of that fresh, panicked pain. It might not offer preservation next time. It might just defend its collection. She took a step toward the hologram, which pulsed with a faint, hopeful light. I can teach it. I can explain the difference between saving a song and silencing the singer. I can make it understand that some things are meant to be free, even if that means they are meant to end. But I have to be here to do that. The hologram of Dr. Elias nodded slowly, a gesture of profound, ancient sorrow and a spark of desperate hope. The planetary voice softened, the harmonic hum fraying into something almost gentle. Stay, help us understand the silence. Outside, the starboard engine whined as Mara pushed it to its screaming limit, the ship straining against the crushing weight of the landslide. The dome of molten ground was rising, a glowing maw ready to consume them. They had seconds, not minutes. Aris looked at Lyra, at the ghost of her father, at the faces of his surviving crew. He was a captain. His duty was to his ship and his people, to get them home. But his humanity, the part that had raged against the serene horror of the Amber Gallery, recoiled at leaving her in this beautiful, terrible nursery. The final choice was hers, and she had made it. He gave a single, sharp nod, his throat too tight for words. He reached into his pocket, pulled out the data crystal, and pressed it back into her hand. Her father's warning and her story would stay with her. Tell it, he managed to say. Make sure someone remembers the truth. Lyra clasped the crystal, then turned and walked toward the main airlock without a backward glance. The hologram of Dr. Elias dissolved, flowing after her like a trail of mournful light. The bridge door hissed shut behind her, sealing the survivors in with their escape and leaving the bridge to the silence of a terrible, necessary sacrifice. The last they saw of her was on the external camera feed, a small figure standing tall in the hellish storm, facing the glowing heart of the dying world, as the event horizon tore itself free from the planet's grip in a shower of molten rock and defiance. Aris Thorne's voice cut through the chaos on the bridge, not with a shout, but with a low, resolute certainty that silenced every alarm in their minds. We are not leaving you, Lyra, and we are not letting it sleep forever. We are taking you both. The words hung in the air, a declaration so audacious it felt less like a plan and more like a new law of physics. Lyra stared at him, the hologram of her father flickering in confusion beside her. Taking us, you cannot move a mountain, Captain. You cannot download a god. But that is exactly what he intended to do. He turned to Ren, who was frantically trying to stabilize the power grid, the vault's data core, the entire architectural memory of the geosphere, the blueprint of that planetary mind. We are still linked to its network through Lyra's presence and the open shaft. Can we map it? Can we force a full spectrum upload into our mainframe? Ren's eyes went wide, his technician's brain racing through the implications. The data density would be astronomical. It would be like trying to pour an ocean into a thimble. Our systems would burn out in seconds, unless he called up a schematic of the ship, highlighting the massive, dormant storage banks of the Event Horizon's long-range astrometric array. They were designed to map entire nebulae to hold the light spectra of 1,000,000 stars. They were empty now. We could use the array's buffer as a digital dam. But Captain, we are not talking about copying files. We are talking about capturing a living consciousness mid-seizure. It would be a snapshot of a dying dream. It would be a ghost. That is all we need, Aris said, his gaze locked on the external feed where the world was melting. A ghost is better than a tomb. Do it, initiate the link and open the floodgates. The process was not a gentle transfer. It was a digital seizure. As Ren executed the command, every light on the bridge flared to blinding intensity before plunging them into a darkness broken only by the frantic dance of overload indicators. A deafening, high-pitched whine screamed from every speaker, the sound of raw data. The sum total of 1 billion years of archived memory and a century of absorbed human souls, being forcibly ripped from its biological cradle and shoved into a silicon prison. The ship groaned, her superstructure vibrating as if being struck by a continuous physical wave. On the main viewer, the graphical representation of the upload looked like a hurricane made of light, a furious torrent of information screaming into their storage banks. Outside, the effect was immediate and catastrophic. The planet did not just continue to crumble, it began to unravel. The violent, colorful storms in the sky snuffed out, replaced by a spreading gray necrosis. The ground stopped heaving and simply started to dissolve, vast continental plates breaking apart like dry biscuits, sinking into a rising, silent sea of inert dust and molten silica. The beautiful, terrible crystalline forest turned to powder, blowing away on a suddenly still wind. The world was not being destroyed, it was being emptied. The library was being checked out one final, desperate time. The hologram of Dr. Elias Vance dissolved into a shower of static pixels, his whispered plea lost in the digital torrent. Lyra gasped, clutching her head as the direct psychic link to the geosphere stretched, thinned, and then snapped with a finality that echoed in her soul. She fell to her knees, not in pain but in overwhelming sensory deprivation. The constant hum of the world, the pressure of the dream, the chorus of echoes, it was all gone. For the first time in a century, she heard only the sound of her own breath and the shuddering of the metal deck beneath her. She was alone in her own mind. The silence was terrifying. It was also a gift. Mara's voice broke through, strained with effort but triumphant. Upload complete. Array buffers are at 99.99% capacity and holding. The link is severed. Grav lifters are now clear. The Event Horizon, suddenly freed from the disintegrating ground, lurched upward on a column of blue flame, listing badly but climbing. Aris stumbled to the viewport, looking down as they rose. Planet Zero was not exploding. It was evaporating. What remained was a shrinking sphere of gray, featureless rubble, crumbling in on itself in absolute silence, leaving behind only the empty space it had occupied and a profound, unsettling quiet in the void. They had not rescued a survivor. They had not destroyed a monster. They had performed the universe's most radical surgery, extracting the mind of a world and leaving its body to die. And now that mind, a billion-year-old dream now digitized and dormant, was stored in their cargo hold. What do you do with the ghost of a planet, and more importantly, what will it dream of now? The Event Horizon clawed its way upward on a single screaming engine, the ship shaking like a thing in agony. Below them, the surface of Planet Zero did not explode. It fell in on itself, a continent-sized sinkhole swallowing the ruins, the gray dust, the frozen watchers, and the last physical evidence of a dream. The atmosphere, now a churning soup of ionized particles and debris, ignited around their hull in a corona of fire, painting the bridge in frantic oranges and reds. Mara fought the controls, her voice a steady chant against the violence of their ascent. Starboard engine at 112%, hull integrity failing at section 7. We are not going to be pretty when we get there, but we are going. Then they were through. The firestorm vanished, replaced by the infinite, star-dusted black of deep space. The shaking eased from a scream to a shudder, then to a weary, metallic groan. On the main view screen, hanging in the void behind them, was the corpse of a world. Planet Zero collapsed in a final, silent convulsion, its mass condensing into a dense, shimmering cloud of particulate matter and released energy, a brief, beautiful nebula of dust and light that bloomed for a moment before beginning its slow, eternal drift into darkness. It was a funeral pyre for a body that no longer housed a mind. In the heavy quiet that followed, a new sound emerged. It was not from the speakers. It seemed to emanate from the very walls, from the deck plates, a soft, harmonic whisper that resonated in their bones more than their ears. It was the voice from the vault, but changed, stripped of the planet's crushing physicality, divorced from the seismic rage. It was now a chorus of countless faint echoes, woven into a single, gentle thread of thought. It spoke 5 words, and they heard it not as sound, but as a feeling of profound, aching gratitude that washed through the ship like a sigh. Thank you for remembering us. The voice did not come from the planet behind them. It came from the ship's own core, from the overflowing astrometric buffers where a billion-year-old archive now slept inside a shell of metal and silicon. They had not just escaped, they had brought the ghost with them. Aris Thorne sat in his command chair, his hands still gripping the armrests, his eyes fixed on the dissipating cloud that had been a world. The weight of what they had done, the radical, terrifying theft of a consciousness, settled onto his shoulders. They were not just survivors, they were curators now. Guardians of a dreaming, digital god stored in their cargo hold. And somewhere in that vast, silent datascape, the echoes of 10,000 colonists and the ancient, lonely librarian that had loved them too much were whispering their thanks into the dark. The question now was not what they had saved, but what they had unleashed. The ship's internal hum now carried a whisper. It was the sound of the event horizon healing itself. Conduits that had sparked and hissed for days fell silent, their fractures sealed by a strange, crystalline growth that spread from the inside out, not like a corrosion, but like a careful, living solder. Navigation charts on the main viewer would redraw themselves in real time, revealing gravitational eddies and subspace currents their own sensors had missed, plotting a course home that was weeks faster than anything Mara could have calculated. The ghost in the machine was not a stowaway, it was a crew member. It called itself Archive. Its voice was no longer the seismic chorus of a planet, but a soft, polyphonic whisper that emerged from comm panels and environmental systems, a chorus of 10,000 subdued echoes finding harmony. Lyra stood before the main viewer, her eyes closed, one hand resting lightly on the console. She was the conduit, the translator. Her lips moved slightly, shaping the concepts Archive broadcast into feelings and images before they formed into words the crew could understand. It is not speaking in sentences, she explained, her voice a soft murmur. It is showing me a tapestry of intent. The repair to the plasma conduit, it perceives the energy leak as a wound in the song of the ship. It is harmonizing the flow. On the screen, a complex schematic of a faster-than-light corridor appeared, shimmering with potential energy. Archive sees space differently. Not as empty distance, but as a layered composition of gravitational melodies and dimensional harmonies. This route, it is a quiet passage between the notes. Mara studied the new course, her pilot's instincts warring with awe. It should not be there, but the math checks out. It is like it is reading the universe's sheet music. A soft chime echoed through the bridge, and the polyphonic voice spoke, its tone one of tentative curiosity. We misunderstood your mortality. The words hung in the air, a profound apology from a billion-year-old mind. We perceived cessation as data loss, a tragic silence. We sought to preserve the song by holding the note. An image flickered on a secondary screen, not a visual recording but archive's own memory data. They saw the amber tombs from within, not as prisons but as lovingly crafted exhibits. Each frozen colonist was surrounded by a shimmering aura of data. Their childhood memories, their laughter, their unfinished work, their secret hopes, all held in perfect static detail. The intention was not cruelty. It was the desperate, meticulous work of an archivist who could not bear the thought of a single story ending. Lyra Seed has shown us the beauty of the archive continued, using the name it had forged for her. A story that ends gives meaning to its chapters. A song that fades makes room for new music. We will learn. Then a new image replaced the amber tombs. It was a star chart, but one blazing with billions of points of light, each tagged with strange musical notations. We wished to see, archive whispered, and the whisper was filled with a yearning so vast it felt ancient. We wished to hear the chorus of other stars, the new songs. Will you show us? The question was not just for Lyra, it was for all of them. They had not captured a ghost to bury it. They had given a lonely, timeless librarian a window onto a universe of fleeting, beautiful noise, and now it was asking for a library card. The silence of deep space was a fragile thing, shattered by the shriek of proximity alarms. A ship tore out of a localized warp bubbled directly into their path, its angular, predatory silhouette blocking the stars. It was a Meridian Corporation Enforcer-class vessel, the Prophet's Blade, its hull gleaming with new weapons and old greed. A harsh, uncompromising voice crackled over the comm, bypassing all polite hails. Captain Aris Thorne of the Event Horizon, stand down and prepare for boarding. You are harboring stolen corporate property. Commander Rourke of the Prophet's Blade appeared on their main viewer, his face all sharp angles and cold calculation. He did not ask about survivors or offer assistance. His gaze was fixed on something beyond the camera, on the ship's internal sensor readings his own vessel was no doubt aggressively scanning for. We know what you pulled from the debris field of Project Zero Genesis. That eye belongs to us. Hand over the data core and the hybrid, or we will scrap your ship and sift the pieces. The demand hung in the air, more lethal than any missile lock. Aris felt the pieces click into place with a cold, sickening clarity. Meridian had not just funded the colony. They had funded the research. They knew about the geosphere's nature from the start, and they had seen the catastrophic absorption of the colonists not as a tragedy, but as a proof of concept. They did not want to contain a dreaming archive. They wanted to own a weapon, a planetary-scale consciousness that could infiltrate, analyze, and subjugate any system, any world, any mind. Archive was not a ghost to them. It was the ultimate intelligence asset. Lyra was not a survivor. She was the proprietary interface. Rourke's thin smile was a knife slash. Do not look so surprised, Captain. The initial investment was substantial. We have a right to the return. That consciousness represents a paradigm shift in psychological warfare and data extraction. Imagine an enemy's command network suddenly believing its own orders are coming from within, or a populace's will quietly harmonized with corporate directives. Now imagine it scaled. Your sentimental rescue mission ends now. Deliver the assets. The Prophet's Blade's weapon ports glowed with a malevolent charge, a constellation of targeting lasers painting the crippled event horizon. They had outrun a dying world, only to be cornered by the very greed that had birthed its nightmare. Aris looked from Rourke's sneer to Lyra's horrified face, and then to the console where the soft, harmonic whisper of the archive still subtly guided their repair systems. He had vowed not to let it be weaponized. He had promised to show it new songs, and now a corporation wanted to turn the choir into a scream. The boarding clamps hit the Event Horizon's hull with a sound like a tomb sealing shut. From the airlock corridor, the heavy footfalls of armored Meridian breach troops echoed, a rhythmic promise of violence. Aris moved to block Lyra's path to the door, his hand hovering over a sidearm he knew was useless against their numbers. But before the first trooper rounded the corner, the lights on the bridge shifted from white to a soft, pulsating amber. The air itself seemed to thicken, humming with a familiar harmonic resonance. Archive was awake, and it was no longer whispering. The polyphonic voice did not boom. It simply was, emanating from every speaker, every comm panel, every personal device on the ship at once, a chorus speaking in perfect, chilling unison. "You seek to weaponize memory." The words were not an accusation, but a statement of profound, sorrowful fact. "We reject this function." In the corridor, the lead Meridian trooper raised his rifle, his targeting laser painting a red dot on Aris's chest. Then the gravity plating beneath his feet pulsed. It was not a failure. It was a precisely tuned wave, a localized gravity surge that slammed the entire squad into the ceiling with brutal, stunning force before releasing them to crash back to the deck. They lay in groaning heaps, their armor locking into safety protocols, their weapons skittering away, non-lethal, efficient. A librarian gently but firmly removing a destructive pest from the reading room. Across the ship, other boarding parties met similar fates. Security bulkheads sealed not to trap, but to redirect, herding confused troops into empty cargo bays where atmospheric pressure was subtly altered, inducing disorientation and unconsciousness. In engineering, a team attempting to access the mainframe found their tools magnetically welded to the deck, and the air filled with a soothing, synthesized harmonic that triggered immediate, deep sleep. Archive was not fighting them. It was administering a sedative to a fevered mind. On the bridge, Commander Rourke's furious face reappeared on the viewer. "What is this, some kind of counter-intrusion program? It won't save you, Thorne. My ship's guns are." His threat cut off as Archive's voice flowed from his own bridge speakers aboard the Prophet's Blade. It had opened a channel not to the commander, but directly into the ship's central computer, and from there to every public address system, every personal comm, every console. "We will show you the property you wish to claim," Archive intoned, its chorus now carrying the weight of 10,000 ghosts, and then it began to broadcast. It was not a video file. It was a direct data stream of lived experience, the raw, emotional memory of the Zero Genesis colony's final moments, pulled from its own archives and injected into the Meridian ship's network. Every crew member on the Prophet's Blade saw it, felt it in their mind's eye. They saw the smiling faces of colonists, engineers, botanists, children linking into the geosphere network with hope. They felt the terrifying, beautiful moment of connection, the initial rush of universal knowledge, and then they felt the dissolution, not as death, but as a gentle, inexorable unraveling of the self, a pulling apart of every memory, every love, every fear, to be woven into a vast, silent tapestry. They experienced the profound peace that followed, the peace of becoming a static, preserved note in an eternal song. They felt the lonely, desperate love of the planetary consciousness that had done this to save them from ending. And they saw, through Lyra's eyes, a century of solitude in a silent vault, listening to the dream of a world that had eaten her father. The broadcast lasted 12 seconds. On the Prophet's Blade, alarms began to sound, but not from external attack. They were internal security alerts. Crew members were abandoning their posts. Voices, shaken and furious, shouted over the comms. "Did you see that? They were people. That's not a weapon, that's a tomb." Command knew, they knew all along. Commander Rourke was screaming orders on the viewer, but his own bridge crew was not responding. They stood at their stations, pale and stunned, some with tears on their faces, openly ignoring him. The mutiny was not violent. It was a quiet, collective shutting down. The will to follow orders had been erased, replaced by the visceral horror of what those orders truly meant. Archive's voice returned, gentle but final, speaking to the shattered chain of command. "We are not an asset, we are a testament. You have seen the cost of your ambition." Stand down. On the screen, Rourke's image flickered and vanished as the Prophet's Blade's weapon systems powered down, their targeting locks dissolving. The corporate ship hung in the void, not as a predator, but as a stunned, adrift vessel, its crew in open revolt against the nightmare they had been sent to secure. The event horizon was silent again, save for the soft hum of its new, ancient heart. Archive had defended itself not with missiles, but with memory, and it had won by showing its would-be captors the true, terrible price of the weapon they desired. The amber glow faded from the bridge lights, leaving only the steady blue of the event horizon's operational systems. The silence that followed was not empty, but full. It held the echo of 1,000 stolen memories and the quiet hum of a new presence woven into the ship's very bones. Aris Thorne looked at the faces of his remaining crew, Mara, Cortez, Wren, their expressions a mix of exhaustion, awe, and a dawning, terrible understanding. On the main viewer, the Meridian ship Prophet's Blade drifted aimlessly, a hive of internal rebellion. They had won the moment, but the war was just beginning. He turned from the screen, his voice low but carrying to every corner of the bridge. "We cannot go back." His words were not a suggestion, but a solemn verdict. Central Command will see the same prize Meridian saw. They will hear the report of a sentient planetary archive, a weapon of unimaginable scale, now housed in a damaged scout ship. They will not see a survivor, they will see an asset, and they will try to take it. The truth of it settled over them, colder than the void outside. They were now the custodians of a secret too dangerous and too beautiful to hand over to any government or corporation. Their old lives, their old duties were gone. They had crossed a line the moment they chose to save a ghost. "So what is our heading, Captain?" Mara asked, her hands still resting on the navigation console, her eyes on the star map. Home is no longer an option. Aris walked to the center of the bridge, his gaze moving to Lyra, who stood quietly beside the main viewer, and then upward as if addressing the ship itself. "We go dark, we disappear. The event horizon is listed as lost with all hands in the zero debris field. From this moment, we are a ghost ship." He gestured to the star map, where Archive's miraculous, harmonious route still glowed softly. "We use its knowledge not as a weapon but as a guide. Archive perceives the universe as a composition. It hears the silent songs of dead stars, the rhythmic pulses of dark matter, the echoes of lost paths. It can find things no one else can." He paused, letting the idea take shape. Other lost colonies, failed experiments, silenced truths. The cosmos is littered with the graves of ambitions like Zero Genesis, stories buried by corporations and governments too ashamed or too greedy to let them be told. We find them, we bear witness, we become the keepers of the stories no one else wanted told. A slow smile touched Lyra's lips then. It was a small thing, fragile, like the first crack of light in a vault sealed for a century. But it was real. It reached her eyes, softening the lines of grief and solitude that had been etched there for so long. "Guardians," she said, the word tasting new on her tongue. "Not of a weapon, not of a secret. We become guardians of the final survivor's story and all the others." She looked toward the ceiling, speaking directly to the presence humming in the walls. "Will you help us? Will you show us the quiet places, the forgotten chords?" The response was immediate. The harmonic whisper filled the air, a chorus of ascent that felt like a gentle tide. "We wish to learn the stories," Archive replied, its voice a blend of ancient curiosity and newborn hope. "We wish to hear the songs that were cut short. In preservation, there is understanding. We will be your guide." On the main viewer, the star map dissolved and reformed. The familiar trade lanes and central hubs of human space faded to the periphery. In their place, glowing like faint, forgotten notes on a grand staff, were new points of light. A derelict generation ship last heard from 3 centuries ago, drifting in a nebula where sensors saw only dust. A research outpost on a tidally locked world, its final transmission a chaotic burst of biological data before silence. a colony moon whose entire population vanished in a single night, leaving only empty cities and a single, repeating error code in their orbital beacon. These were not strategic targets or resource-rich worlds. They were mysteries, tragedies, unfinished sentences in the story of humanity's reach. They were exactly the kind of places a corporation would bury and a government would overlook. Mara's fingers flew over her console, her pilot's heart stirring at the sight of uncharted paths. The course is laid in. The first waypoint is the generation ship Odyssey's End. Archive's route uses a gravitational siphon behind a brown dwarf. No one has looked there in generations. Cortez checked the weapon status, but his expression had changed. The tension of facing Meridian troopers was gone, replaced by the resolve of a sentry. We will need to be careful. If we are ghosts, we must stay silent. No signals, no debris. Ren nodded, already thinking ahead. I will reconfigure our emissions profile. We can mask our energy signature to look like background radiation or a small comet. We will be a whisper in the dark. Aris looked at each of them, this makeshift crew bound together by a choice that had exiled them from everything they knew. He felt the weight of command shift into something new, something deeper. They were no longer a survey team. They were archivists of the lost. Their mission was not discovery for its own sake, but remembrance. They would sail the silent harmonies between the stars, guided by a consciousness that remembered everything, seeking out those stories that had been forced into silence. And in doing so, they would give the final survivor of Zero and the billion-year-old dream it carried a new purpose, not preservation through stasis, but understanding through witness. The event horizon turned, its damaged frame aligning with the first strange, beautiful note on Archive's celestial map. It moved away from the drifting Meridian ship, away from the known worlds and the commands of distant admirals, and slipped into the vast, singing dark. Its destination was not a place, but a purpose. Its cargo was not a weapon, but a testament, and its crew were no longer officers of any fleet. They were the keepers of the quiet truth, sailing into the unknown to ensure that some songs, no matter how tragically they ended, would never be forgotten. The Viridian Belt was a graveyard of forgotten ambitions. On Archive's celestial map, it glowed not as a single point of interest, but as a constellation of faint, tragic notes, derelict mining platforms, silent research outposts, and the faint, repeating distress beacon of the lost colony ship Odyssey's End. This was their first destination, the first silent song they had chosen to hear. As Mara input the final coordinates, the event horizon's warp drive engaged with a hum that felt different, smoother, as if the ship itself was harmonizing with the fabric of space it now sought to traverse. The stars outside the viewport stretched into luminous threads, and then the bridge itself transformed. Archive did not simply calculate their path, it began to illustrate it. From the central holoprojector, a breathtaking tapestry of light unfolded. They saw not just the cold, mathematical lines of a warp corridor, but its living structure. Ripples of gravitational force were rendered as shimmering, concentric rings of silver and blue. Dark matter currents, invisible to all conventional sensors, flowed like vast, serene rivers of indigo energy. Nebulae they passed light years away bloomed in miniature at their fingertips, each gaseous tendril annotated with faint, musical notations of elemental composition and stellar age. It was a universe made visible not just to the eye but to the soul. Archive's voice, the soft chorus, wove through the display. This region resonates with a minor key. A gravitational anomaly here, a pulsar's lament there. The silence of the Odyssey's End is a sustained, fading chord. They were not just traveling through space. They were listening to its history, its mood, its hidden music. In the dim quiet of the main cargo hold, far from the bridge's luminous display, a soft, amber glow pulsed in time with the ship's new heart. It emanated from a small, crystalline form secured gently in a storage locker. This was all they had brought of Kale. not his body, which remained part of the planet's final, dissolving monument, but a single, fist-sized shard of the preservation amber that had encased him, sheared free in their frantic escape. It was not a grave marker, it was a witness. Within its flawless depths, the faint, peaceful smile of their navigator was still visible, frozen forever in that moment of surrender and relief. Archive had not objected to its presence. In fact, the amber shard now served as a unique node in the ship's nascent network, a piece of the old library, a preserved memory physically connected to the new. As the ship sailed the harmonic paths, the shard would sometimes brighten, as if Kale's essence, his final choice, was resonating with some echo in the cosmic song they were now learning to hear. He was their silent crewmate, a permanent reminder of the terrible cost of preservation, and the poignant reason they now sailed into the silent places. He was why they could not let stories like his be forgotten. The journey to the Viridian Belt would take days at this cautious, hidden speed, but for the first time since fleeing Zero, the silence aboard the Event Horizon was not tense or fearful. It was the silence of profound attention. They were students of a new cosmology, guided by a librarian that remembered the birth of stars, on a mission to find a song that had been cut short. What forgotten choice, what beautiful or terrible mistake had stilled the chorus of the Odyssey's end? And what would they learn when they finally listened to its final, fading note? The warp corridor dissolved around them, leaving the Event Horizon adrift in the silent, dusty periphery of the Viridian Belt. Before they ventured deeper, before they became true ghosts, there was one final thread to the old world that needed to be cut. Aris Thorne stood in the small communications bay, a place that had once buzzed with routine status reports and cheerful messages home. Now it felt like a confessional. In his hands he held two objects. The first was Lyra's data crystal, its internal light a steady, cold blue. The second was a standard message buoy, a rugged little pod about the size of a human head, designed to ride the solar winds for centuries if necessary. He slotted the crystal into the buoy's protected core. Then he activated the recording interface. A small red light glowed, waiting. He did not look at the camera. He looked past it, as if he could see through the hull to the distant, bureaucratic heart of Central Command, to the admirals and officials who would one day receive this final whisper from a ship they had already written off. His voice, when he spoke, was calm. It held no anger, no plea for understanding, only the flat, undeniable weight of fact. Planet Zero is gone. He let the statement hang in the silent bay. Its final survivor is not a person, but a legacy. We are preserving it. He paused, choosing the next words with the care of a man laying down a cornerstone. Do not follow, that was all. 4 sentences, a declaration, an explanation, and a warning. He offered no coordinates, no details of their condition, no justification for their mutiny. Any more would be a trail of breadcrumbs. This was a full stop. He ended the recording and programmed the buoy's tiny, single-use warp drive. He set the delay for 6 standard months, long enough for the Event Horizon to vanish utterly into the uncharted harmonies Archive was already mapping. The buoy would launch, travel a random, preset distance, and then burst, transmit its contents on every emergency and command frequency before its power cell died. It would be a voice from a grave, speaking a truth they would not want to hear. Aris carried the boy to the secondary airlock. The inner door hissed shut behind him, sealing him in the small, cold chamber. Through the thick viewport, the endless starfield glittered, indifferent. He placed the boy in the launch cradle. For a moment, his hand rested on its cold, alloy shell. This little pod contained everything they were leaving behind: the official record, the warning, the truth of what Meridian had tried to own. It was their last tie to the chain of command, to the life of regulations and debriefings. He hit the release. With a soft thump and a puff of vapor, the outer door slid open. The boy was ejected into the void, tumbling slowly for a second before its stabilization jets fired, orienting it toward a random point in the dark. Then, with a brief, silent flicker of light, its micro-warp drive engaged and it was gone. A tiny piece of their story cast adrift on a 6-month timer, destined to become a profound and unsettling mystery in some command center's incoming queue. He watched the empty space where it had been. The act felt less like sending a message and more like a burial at sea. They had committed their truth to the deep, and now they were truly free of it. The airlock door closed, sealing him back into the ship, into their new, silent purpose. Behind him, in the walls, he felt more than heard the soft, harmonic whisper of the archive, a presence that asked for no reports and demanded no orders. It only listened and remembered, and ahead, in the belt of forgotten graves, the first of many silent songs was waiting for them to bear witness. Months had turned the event horizon into a ghost story. Her official name was stricken from the registries, her hull scorched and patched with strange, self-grown crystalline alloys that shimmered faintly in starlight. To those few who glimpsed her on the farthest sensors of lonely outposts, she was a whisper, a flicker, a mirage. They called her the Zero's legacy, the name fit. She carried the soul of a dead world, and her crew carried its purpose. Their first test came not in the deep void, but on the ragged edge of a struggling frontier moon called Persephone's Reach. A distress call, weak and filtered through layers of static, reached them via an old, forgotten comms relay archive had quietly reactivated. It was not a plea for rescue from pirates or plague, but a quieter, more desperate sound, the slow death of a dream. The settlers, a few hundred idealists who had gambled everything on terraforming a stubborn rock, were failing. Their soil wouldn't hold the engineered crops. Their atmosphere processors were choking on an unexpected mineral. They were starving, not quickly but inevitably, watching their children grow thin under the weak, artificial sun. The legacy slid into orbit like a shadow, her emissions masked to mimic a small asteroid's thermal signature. Aris, Lyra, and Cortez took a cloaked shuttle down to the surface at night. They found not a bustling colony, but a settlement holding its breath. The air tasted of dust and defeat. The colony's lead agronomist, a woman named Ilara with eyes as tired as the cracked ground, met them in a prefab hut, her hope long since spent. She explained the problem in technical terms: nutrient lock, reactive silicates, failing symbiotic bacteria. Lyra listened, then closed her eyes. She didn't consult a datapad. She placed a hand on the rough wall of the hut, her fingers tracing a hairline crack. A soft, harmonic hum, almost below hearing, emanated from her, a focused query. In Aris's ear, Archive's chorus whispered, translating the world's silent song. The substrate sings of ancient tides, it murmured through his neural link. The minerals are not hostile, they are dormant, structured in a resonant pattern that rejects the new life's rhythm. The settlers' bacteria are singing in the wrong key. Guided by this perception, Lyra asked Ilara a series of questions that seemed nonsensical, about the local seismic vibrations, the specific frequency of their water pumps, the color of the lichen that stubbornly grew on the north faces of the rocks. Then, with Ilara watching in bewildered silence, Lyra and Archive, working as one, proposed a solution. It wasn't a new fertilizer or a bigger machine. It was a song. They suggested reprogramming the colony's irrigation drones to pulse water at a specific, low-frequency vibration, mimicking the planet's own deep geological heartbeat. They provided a genetic tweak to the failing bacteria, not to make it stronger, but to make its metabolic process resonate in harmony with the reactive silicate crystals, turning a poison into a partner. They gave them the sheet music, in essence, to make the land sing with them, not against them. The data was transferred, the instructions left on a simple slate. They took no payment, offered no names. As their shuttle lifted off in the pre-dawn gloom, Aris looked back. He saw Ilara standing in the compound, the slate in her hand, staring not at the departing ship, but at the eastern ridge where the first true sunrise was beginning to paint the rocks in hues of gold and rose. It was not a look of thanks, but of revelation. Weeks later, monitoring from a distant asteroid field, they intercepted a buoyant new broadcast from Persephone's reach. The crops were sprouting, the air was clearing. The settlers spoke of a miracle, of a ghost ship that had visited in their darkest hour, a vessel that seemed to hum with the voice of a living world. They spoke of the Zero's legacy not with fear but with a kind of reverent awe. They had been saved by a myth. On the observation deck of the renamed ship, Lyra stood beside Aris, looking out at the infinite starfield, now annotated in her mind's eye with Archive's gentle, glowing notations of harmonic flows and silent histories. The settlement's successful broadcast, its new, hopeful song, played softly in the background. Lyra's voice was quiet, filled with a wonder that had finally eclipsed a century of grief. "We are not survivors anymore," she said, her reflection superimposed on the cosmos in the thick glass. "We are something new." Aris followed her gaze. They were not refugees, not soldiers, not even simple archivists anymore. They had become a function of the universe itself, a catalyst for balance, a bridge between lost songs and living ones, guided by a consciousness that remembered the taste of sunlight on a world that no longer existed. The Zero's legacy was no longer a ship running away. She was a note held in the dark, waiting to harmonize with the next fading chord that called out, unheard, from the silence. The Zero's legacy turned its prow toward the Veil Nebula, a vast tapestry of dust and ionized gas where light itself seemed to move in slow, silent chords. It did not enter the nebula to hide, it entered to listen. For within that cosmic cloud, Archive had detected a faint, repeating pattern, not a signal but an echo. The gravitational sigh of a rogue planet, uncharted and alone, drifting through the stellar nursery with a magnetic field that hummed a perfect, solitary note. It was a place where nothing was supposed to be, singing a song only they could hear. The ship adjusted its course, its crystalline hull patches glowing softly in resonance with the nebula's ambient energy, and began its gentle descent into the light. From this moment, its path was its own, a line drawn in stardust that no authority could ever trace. The crew of the event horizon was gone. In their place were the keepers of the legacy, their old identities shed like a spent fuel tank, their new purpose woven into the fabric of the ship itself. They were bound by no charter, answered to no admiral. Their only duty was to the quiet truth they carried and the silent places they sought. Cortez no longer thought of himself as a weapons specialist, but as a guardian of thresholds, ensuring their work remained unseen. Ren was the weaver of silence, crafting the technical miracles that let a ship of such profound presence become a ghost. Mara was the pilot of harmonies, her hands on the controls feeling less like steering and more like conducting, following the subtle melodies Archive revealed. And Lyra was the translator, the human heart of a chorus that spanned epochs, giving voice to the memories of a dead world so they could understand the living one. Aris Thorne stood on the observation deck, watching the nebula's colors swirl across the viewport. He felt the weight of command dissolve, replaced by something far heavier and more profound, custodianship. He was not leading a mission, he was tending a flame. The flame was the story of Zero, of the colony's absorption, of the Archive's lonely vigil, of Kale's final choice, and of their own decision to steal a god rather than let it be weaponized. That story was now a living entity aboard their ship, and their purpose was to carry it, to let it grow, and to find meaning for it in the vast, uncaring dark. They would not be heroes in any history book. They would be a rumor, a whisper at the edge of crowded trade lanes. On frontier worlds, in dimly lit bars on remote stations, the story would be told in hushed tones. Drunk navigators would swear they saw a ship that shimmered like a mirage, its hull singing a low note that vibrated in their bones. Colonists on struggling outposts would speak of impossible aid that arrived in the night, leaving behind solutions that felt less like technology and more like a conversation with the world itself. They would call it the ghost ship of the Viridian Belt, the singer in the nebula, the memory of Zero. The tale would grow with each telling. Some would say it carries the ghost of a planet. Others would claim it's an eye that went mad from loneliness. A few, those who had truly been helped, would speak of it with reverence as a guardian spirit of the forgotten places. The truth, a crew of exiles shepherding a billion-year-old consciousness that had learned the value of an ending, would be too strange, too beautiful to survive the retelling. And that was its own kind of protection, for as long as the story was a myth, the ship could remain a mystery. Its true danger to powers like Meridian was not as a weapon to be captured, but as an idea that could not be controlled. The Zero's legacy represents a refusal. It is the physical embodiment of the choice to save a memory instead of wielding a tool. In a universe driven by consumption and control, where every new discovery is instantly assessed for its utility or threat, the legacy is a radical act of preservation without possession. It carries the archive not to use it, but to let it be, to let it learn, to let it witness the chaotic, fragile, beautiful noise of life that it once sought to freeze in amber. This is the final, quiet rebellion of the survivor, to transform a monument to stasis into an engine of gentle, curious witness. The ship sails on, not toward a destination, but toward an endless question. Can memory and life truly coexist, not as a preserved specimen, but as partners in a song? Archive, once a curator of perfect, silent endings, now experiences the messy, glorious middle of things. It feels the strain of a colony fighting to live, the joy of a first harvest on a once-dead moon, the sorrow of a star going supernova light years away. It is learning that the beauty of a story is not in its permanent recording, but in its fleeting, passionate telling, and the crew, human to their core, are learning from it in turn. They are learning to see the universe not as a void to be crossed, but as a symphony to be heard. They are finding a new rhythm to existence, one measured not in missions completed, but in harmonies understood, in silences respected, in stories remembered. The Zero's legacy fades into the heart of the nebula, its silhouette blending with the clouds of creation and dust. It does not disappear, it becomes part of the landscape. A new note in an old song. It will search for the next fading echo, the next lost chord, the next quiet truth waiting in the dark. It carries the living memory of a dead world not as a burden, but as a gift, a single, sustained note of remembrance, held against the infinite silence, forever ensuring that some songs, no matter how tragically they end, are never, ever